Until last week, Romilly Madew was Chief Executive of the government's key infrastructure agency, Infrastructure Australia. She now has a new gig as Chief Executive of Engineers Australia. Now, the parallels should not be missed. It's all about building Australia's future. So I started off by asking her about the key priorities that she sees right now.
This is a really exciting time for the engineers when you think about where we are coming off the back of 2.5 years of COVID and the amazing infrastructure spend that the government had used as stimulus. And we are reliant, as you said, on engineers to do that. So when we look at the infrastructure priority list, it is around ensuring that we have the transport that we need. When we're looking at water and water infrastructure, we've dealt with extreme weather events in the last couple of years. And so, you know, the importance of water and water security for our community. And the next one, obviously, is the energy transition and the impacts of climate change. Everything I'm just talking about now, all reliant on engineers. It's the engineers that come up with the solutions that we need for these big projects. And then the other one is around waste. I mean, look at the circular economy and look, you know, how far we've come when we look at waste and how we reuse our waste. So it's a really exciting time for me because I was involved in developing the infrastructure priority list for the last 3.5 years, and now it's really on the other side of the execution of that list.
Okay, so let's go all the way back and start with the change in behaviour as a result of people now working from home. So does that mean that the priority that was on transport, urban transport, regional transport, that might have lifted as a result of more people working from home and therefore putting less pressure, in particular, on urban transit systems?
So this is a really interesting point. Pre-COVID, we already had a huge population growth, everyone knew, and we did have a backlog in infrastructure. So the projects that are in train now, we still need, irrespective of people working from home. Then coming back to the point about people working from home, what happened with COVID is people chose not to use public transport for safety reasons, and they were going back onto the road. So you'll hear, when you look at the numbers, the congestion numbers are actually higher than pre-COVID. So the aim is really finding that middle ground about getting people back onto public transport and alleviating our roads. Another point is, there's 2 points which are really important. We had this regional migration. So all of a sudden, before we'd been really shining a light on our urban areas, now it's like, do the regions have the infrastructure they need for their growing populations? So there has been an increase in focusing on our regional areas. And the other one that's really interesting that came out of COVID is we were very water, energy and transport focused pre-COVID. Now it's telecommunications, digital data. Talking about, as you've asked, about working from home, we all had to have the access to be able to work from home, telehealth, and we're all doing Zoom and Teams now. So the focus on digital and technology infrastructure has really come to light too. And again, everything I have just mentioned all relies on engineers.
Of course, because they're the builders, they're the creators of the systems. So go to the next one. Let's go to water, because that clearly is an important issue, especially for many of the flood-prone areas of southeast Queensland and northern and right throughout New South Wales. It's been the second most costly insurance event in Australia's history. You've had the town of Lismore pretty much almost, you know, sort of, if you like, wiped out as a result of this in terms of its future is now very doubtful. The question is, it's all about mitigation. That's all engineering. That's building levees. That's protecting communities. That's what it's all about. But the question is, again, where does that sit on that priority list?
So flood mitigation is really important, as well as erosion that we're seeing down on our coasts. Where it's sat on the priority list, both of them very, very important. There are priorities on, now flood mitigation is important because it then impacts transport systems. We've just got to look at what's happened in Western Sydney. It's not just one, it's part of a system. So when you have floods, all of a sudden the productivity of that community is reduced. We have problems around accessing public transport. transport. If we think about bushfires as well, when we're thinking about extreme weather events, we had telecommunications issues as well. So what we need to do as a society, all relying on engineers as well, is taking the impacts of climate change into account when we're either upgrading an asset or we're building a new asset. And this is where, when we look at the infrastructure priority list, it's crucially important because we're not necessarily seeing the impacts of climate change being considered right up the front end when we're planning these major projects. And then we rely on engineers when it comes to that. But sometimes governments they want things done quickly, and they're focusing on other areas. It could be congestion or accessibility. We have to take the impacts of climate change, such as flood mitigation, into account.
Okay, so does that raise questions about the level of population that Australia's urban areas, but also our regional areas, can cope with? If you're putting people in harm's way, you've got to perhaps curtail population growth into the future, or you've got to mitigate properly before you populate those areas.
I think when we're talking about population, it's really about where the best place for people to be. We're going to always have population growth, and if we have a discussion around limiting population, that just opens up a whole raft of other challenges and debates that we will have. But what we need to identify when it comes to planning is putting the people in the right locations that can cope with population. They have access to water, they have access to energy, they have access to transport, and they're not being impacted by climate change, whether that's floods, bushfires or extreme weather events. So it's finding the balance of where we should be putting, growing our areas, whether that's in urban areas or regional areas.
Okay, so then are there issues that you consider that maybe some parts of Australia that have been flooded 2, 3, 4 times over the past 18 months, that the population needs to be picked up and moved somewhere else, somewhere that's safer, that we leave the ghost towns in the past? Just as I can remember when I was a kid, there were ghost towns that were left, like the town of Eildon in Victoria, when they built the dam in Eildon. I mean, I'm just wondering whether that is a part of the future.
Looking at places such as Lismore and whether you should rebuild there, I think we need to firstly have a conversation with the community. It is their home, they've lived there for generations and generations, and there are ways that you can rebuild that take flood mitigation into account. That's the first thing.
But that's engineering, and that's also a cost, right?
That's exactly right.
A conversation about cost.
But that cost is going to happen.
Yes.
Rebuilding Lismore is going to happen. So aren't we best to take that into account right up front and build it back better than build it back the same? The second point is there may be some areas in Lismore that should be shifted in a different location to Lismore. We've seen that in places such as Christchurch when we think about the earthquake. There are areas that are zones in Christchurch that will not be rebuilt on. And we need to have these conversations, but you always have to bring the community into those conversations because they feel like, it's their home. So it is how you rebuild, not just their homes, but the infrastructure around them. So it does, when we have these extreme weather events, it deals with it in better ways, but also is going to have discussions of whether it's floods or bushfires of some locations.
Romilly Madew, always good to chat to you. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity.